There's a photograph that exists in a Pennsylvania archive. It was taken in 1937. 7 children, all under the age of 10, standing in a line outside a cabin with walls so thin you could see daylight through the cracks. Their eyes are hollow, their clothes hang like burial shrouds, but that's not what makes the photograph unbearable to look at. It's the fact that every single one of them shares the same father and the same grandfather. Because in this family, those were the same person. For over 200 years, hidden in the hollows of Appalachia, there existed a bloodline that science would later call impossible. A family that survived in complete isolation, bound not by love or loyalty, but by something far darker. They didn't just marry within the family, they collapsed inward, generation after generation, until the genetic code itself began to scream. Their story was buried, erased from county records, whispered about in churches but never spoken aloud in daylight. And when researchers finally found them, what they discovered wasn't just a family. It was a biological crime scene. This is not folklore. This is not exaggeration. This is documented American history, hidden in medical journals and sealed court files, because what happened to this clan raised questions no one wanted to answer. Questions about how far isolation can warp a family, about what happens when survival becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction, and about the children born into a genetic trap so severe their very existence defied the odds. You won't find their name in textbooks. You won't see their faces in documentaries, because America doesn't like to remember the families it abandoned, the bloodlines it let rot in silence. But their genetics told a story louder than any confession. A story written in bone deformities, cognitive impairments, and a family tree that didn't branch yet circled back on itself like a noose. This is the hidden clan whose genetics raised alarming questions. And once you hear what happened to them, you'll understand why some secrets were never meant to survive. They called themselves the Whittakers, though that name has been changed in some records to protect what little dignity remains. They lived in Odd, West Virginia, a town so remote that even today, most Americans couldn't find it on a map. The family settled there in the early 1800s, back when Appalachia was still a frontier, back when isolation wasn't a choice, but a condition of survival. They built their lives in a valley where the mountains pressed in like walls, where the nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away, and where the outside world felt less like a possibility and more like a myth. At first, they were just another poor family trying to scratch out an existence from unforgiving land. But somewhere in those early decades, something shifted. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the lack of options. Maybe it was a patriarch who decided that keeping the family pure meant keeping it closed. Whatever the reason, the Whittakers stopped marrying outside their bloodline. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. And when those unions produced children, those children grew up knowing only one pool of potential partners, each other. By the time the 20th century arrived, the damage was already generational. The family tree had become a tangle of repeated names, of loops and dead ends, of genetic information copied and recopied until the errors compounded into something unspeakable. There were children born who couldn't speak, children whose faces didn't develop symmetry, children whose bodies grew twisted, whose minds never fully formed, whose lives were spent in a kind of biological prison their ancestors had built without understanding what they were doing. But here's what makes this story even darker. They knew. By the 1920s, by the 1930s, people in the surrounding areas knew something was deeply wrong with the Whittaker family. Local doctors refused to treat them. Churches wouldn't baptize their children, and when social workers finally arrived, They found conditions so disturbing that several of them requested transfers rather than return to that valley. The family had become a local legend, a cautionary tale parents used to frighten children into obedience. But no one intervened. No one stopped it. Because in rural America, in the deep hills where law and oversight barely reached, families like the Whitakers were left to their own devices, even when those devices were destroying them from the inside out. The first official record of genetic concern came in 1940, when a county health inspector filed a report that would later be sealed for decades. He had been sent to investigate reports of malnutrition and neglect. What he found was something medical science at the time could barely explain. He documented 15 family members living in a 3-room shack. No running water, no electricity. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that out of those 15 people, 11 showed signs of severe developmental disabilities. 4 couldn't communicate beyond grunts and gestures. 2 were blind. 3 had physical deformities so pronounced he initially thought they'd survived some kind of industrial accident. But there had been no accident. This was inheritance. The inspector's report described children with microcephaly, skulls and brains smaller than normal. He described limbs that bent at unnatural angles, jaws that didn't close properly, eyes that didn't track movement. He described a boy, maybe 12 years old, who had the cognitive capacity of a toddler and spent his days rocking in a corner, making sounds that didn't resemble language. And when the inspector started asking questions about family relations, about who was related to whom, the answers he received made him physically ill. Mothers who were also sisters, fathers who were also brothers. A family structure so collapsed that the concept of generation had lost all meaning. He recommended immediate intervention. He suggested the children be removed and placed in state care. He urged psychiatric evaluation for the adults. His report was filed, read by exactly 3 people in the county office, and then quietly buried. Because in 1940, in rural West Virginia, families like the Whitakers weren't seen as victims of circumstance. They were seen as problems, embarrassments, proof that some bloodlines were too broken to save, and so they were left alone, left to continue the cycle, left to produce more children into a genetic nightmare that was only getting worse. By the 1960s, researchers from Johns Hopkins University heard rumors of the family. They arrived with cameras, genetic testing kits, and a clinical curiosity that bordered on ghoulish. What they documented became one of the most disturbing case studies in American genetics. They found that the family's coefficient of inbreeding, the mathematical measurement of genetic similarity, was higher than any other recorded human population, higher than isolated island communities, higher than royal bloodlines in ancient Egypt. The Whitakers had achieved a level of genetic collapse that shouldn't have been survivable, and yet they had survived. Generation after generation, their bodies found ways to keep living, even as their genetics screamed for it to stop. The researchers from Johns Hopkins took blood samples. They mapped the family tree going back 5 generations, and what they constructed wasn't a tree at all, it was a knot, a labyrinth of interconnected lines where the same names appeared over and over, occupying multiple positions. A man named Samuel Whitaker appeared as both grandfather and father to the same child. A woman named Loretta was simultaneously aunt, cousin, and mother to 3 different children in the family. The genetic counselors who reviewed the data used words like catastrophic and unprecedented. One researcher, in a letter that wouldn't be published until decades later, wrote that the Whitaker bloodline represented a biological experiment in the limits of human inbreeding. conducted unintentionally over 2 centuries, with results that are as tragic as they are scientifically invaluable. Scientifically invaluable, that phrase haunts the records, because what it really meant was this: the suffering of the Whittaker family had become data. Their deformities, their cognitive disabilities, their shortened lifespans, all of it was being catalogued, measured, and studied. But no one was helping them. The researchers took their samples and left. They published papers in medical journals that most people would never read. They used the Whittakers as evidence in academic arguments about genetic diversity and the dangers of consanguinity. But the family itself remained in that valley, in that shack, continuing the only life they'd ever known. By the 1970s, some of the younger family members had started to leave. A few made it to nearby towns, found work, attempted to build lives outside the bloodline. But even then, the damage traveled with them. One young woman, who managed to marry someone outside the family, gave birth to a son with severe heart defects. The doctors told her it was genetic, something passed down through generations of inbreeding, something that couldn't be undone. Her son lived 6 months. She never had another child. Another family member, a man in his 20s who'd escaped to Charleston, suffered a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. The doctors then noted in his file that his condition was likely hereditary and compounded by familial trauma. He spent the rest of his life in that institution, forgotten by everyone except the siblings he'd left behind. But most of the family never left. They stayed in Odd, West Virginia, because leaving required resources they didn't have, skills they'd never learned, and a world that had made it clear they weren't welcome. The isolation that had caused their genetic collapse now kept them trapped within it. And with each passing year, the family grew smaller, not because they stopped having children, but because those children increasingly didn't survive. Miscarriages became common, stillbirths, infants who lived only days. The bloodline was eating itself. In 2004, a documentary filmmaker named Mark Later stumbled upon the family by accident. He'd been driving through West Virginia, photographing poverty in Appalachia, when a local mentioned the Whittakers. He was told not to go there, told the family didn't like outsiders, told that what he'd find wouldn't be suitable for any film. But Later went anyway, and what he captured on camera would become some of the most viewed and most disturbing footage of American poverty ever recorded. The family was still there, still in that valley. 3 siblings remained, 2 brothers and a sister, all in their 50s and 60s. They lived in a small house that looked like it might collapse under its own weight. The sister, named Lorraine, could communicate, though her speech was slurred and difficult to understand. One brother, named Ray, could only grunt and gesture. The other brother, Timmy, was entirely nonverbal, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of severe genetic abnormality: eyes set too far apart, a flattened nose, a jaw that hung slack. They lived without running water, without heat in the winter, surviving on government assistance that barely covered food, let alone medical care. But what struck Lay to most wasn't the poverty, it was the loneliness. These were people who had been left behind by everyone. Their own extended family had either died or moved away. The community around them treated them like ghosts, acknowledged but never approached. Social services had given up decades ago, and so they existed in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor allowed to fade away. When Later asked Lorraine about their parents, about their childhood, she smiled, a heartbreaking, childlike smile, and said they'd been happy once, that their mother had sung to them, that their father had taught them to fish in the creek. She didn't understand what had been done to them. She didn't have the cognitive framework to grasp that their suffering had been inherited, that they were victims of choices made generations before they were born. Later's footage went viral. Millions watched it, and the comments sections filled with horror, with pity, with anger. People wanted to know why this had been allowed to happen, why no one had stopped it. Why, in the richest country in the world, a family could be left to deteriorate like this. But the truth is simpler and darker than any conspiracy. The Whittakers were abandoned because they were poor, because they were isolated, and because their condition made people uncomfortable. America has never known what to do with families like this, families whose existence raises questions about neglect, about eugenics, about how much suffering we're willing to ignore when it happens out of sight. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed? Would you have tried to break the cycle? Or would you have done what so many others did, looked away and pretended it wasn't happening? After latest documentary spread across the internet, something unexpected happened. People started sending money. Donations poured in from across the country, tens of thousands of dollars meant to help the remaining Whittaker siblings. A GoFundMe was established. Local volunteers began visiting the property, bringing food, fixing the roof, installing a working toilet for the first time in the family's living memory. For a brief moment, it seemed like the story might have a redemptive ending. Like America had finally noticed this forgotten family and decided to do something about it. But the money couldn't fix what was broken. It couldn't reverse the genetic damage. It couldn't give Ray and Timmy the ability to speak, to understand the world beyond their immediate surroundings, to live independently. It couldn't undo the trauma that Lorraine carried, a woman who had spent her entire life caring for brothers who would never be able to care for themselves, who had watched siblings and cousins die young, who had been told by the outside world, through action and inaction, that her family was something to be ashamed of. The donations provided comfort, but comfort isn't the same as dignity, and dignity was something the Whittakers had been denied from birth. Medical experts who reviewed the case estimated that the family's level of inbreeding, sustained over at least 7 generations, had resulted in a loss of genetic diversity so severe that it mirrored extinction, level bottlenecks seen in endangered animal populations. The children born into the later generations of this family had immune systems that couldn't fight off basic infections. They had cardiovascular systems prone to sudden failure. They had neurological development that, in some cases, never progressed beyond that of an infant. One geneticist, speaking anonymously to a medical journal, said that the Whittakers represented a living study of what happens when a human population ignores every biological warning sign. Their bodies had been trying to stop this for generations. But desperation, isolation, and a lack of alternatives had overridden every natural safeguard. And here's the part that makes this story even more disturbing. The Whittakers weren't unique. Across Appalachia, across isolated rural communities in America, there are other families. Not as extreme, perhaps, but carrying the same patterns. Researchers have identified dozens of bloodlines in Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, where cousin marriage was normalized for generations, where genetic disorders cluster in ways that can't be explained by chance. These families don't make the news. They don't get documentaries. They live quietly, struggling with disabilities that have no clear cause in their medical records, because no one ever asks about the family tree. No one wants to know, because knowing means confronting an uncomfortable truth, that America's abandonment of its rural, poor, created conditions where genetic catastrophe became inevitable. The Whittaker family still exists. As of the last update, Lorraine, Ray, and Timmy are still alive, still in that valley, still dependent on the kindness of strangers who saw a documentary and felt compelled to help. but they're aging. And when they're gone, the bloodline will likely end with them. There are no children left to carry it forward. The genetic collapse that took 2 centuries to build will disappear in a single generation, leaving behind nothing but medical records and a few hours of disturbing footage that will live forever on the internet. But their story won't end there, because what happened to the Whittakers is a mirror. It reflects back every failure of the systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable people. It shows what happens when poverty becomes so extreme that options disappear. When isolation becomes so complete that the outside world stops feeling real. When genetic science is used to study suffering rather than prevent it. The researchers who documented this family treated them like specimens. The government agencies that knew about them treated them like problems too expensive to solve. And the communities around them treated them like ghosts, visible but untouchable, pitied but never embraced. There's a question that haunts every ethical discussion about the Whittakers. Should they have been stopped? Should the state have intervened generations ago, forcibly preventing marriages between close relatives, removing children from homes, breaking the cycle through legal authority? It's easy to say yes from a distance. Easy to argue that intervention would have prevented unimaginable suffering, but forced sterilization, forced separation of families, these are the tools of eugenics. These are the methods that America used in the early 20th century to control populations it deemed undesirable. And once you open that door, once you give the state the power to decide which families are allowed to reproduce, history has shown us exactly where that leads. So we're left with an impossible situation, a family destroyed by isolation and inbreeding, but no clear ethical path to have prevented it without invoking authoritarian control. A tragedy that unfolded over 200 years, visible to everyone who cared to look, but stopped by no one. The Whittakers are a testament to how thoroughly a society can fail the people it claims to protect. They're proof that neglect can be just as deadly as malice, and sometimes more cruel, because neglect allows suffering to compound across generations until it becomes something beyond. The photograph from 1937 still exists in that Pennsylvania archive. Those 7 children standing in a line, staring at a camera with eyes that knew nothing but the valley they were born into. Most of them didn't live to see 30. Their names are forgotten, their graves are unmarked. But their genetics told a story that will be studied for as long as medical science exists. A story of what happens when a family is left to collapse in on itself, when isolation becomes inheritance, and when the only thing passed down through generations is suffering. This is the hidden clan whose genetics raised alarming questions. Questions we still don't have good answers for. Questions about intervention and autonomy, about poverty and responsibility, about how much we're willing to ignore when the suffering happens out of sight. The Whittakers survived 2 centuries, but survival isn't the same as living, and sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to a family is let them continue when everything in their biology is begging for it to stop.